Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for tuning in for my presentation, A Saga in a Network and a Network of a Saga. My name is Katarzyna Anna Kapitan and I'm a research fellow at the Museum of National History at the Frederiksborg Castle in Denmark. Before I get to my presentation, I would like to start by thanking the organizers for putting this event together in these uncertain times. You did a terrific job. It is an absolutely amazing lineup, and I am really looking forward to watching the pre-recorded presentations and participating in the live discussions next week. This event is especially important for me because it allows me to reflect upon my doctoral research after a break of almost 2 years. I submitted my PhD in August 2018, and since then, I worked on a project which isn't really related to what I focused on in my PhD. I hope that the considerations I will present today will open up for an interesting discussion during the live session next week. Let me start by presenting the structure of my presentation. First, I will give you some background information on the tradition I am working with, which is Old Norse Icelandic literature. And here I will also introduce the case study, which will be at the center of my talk. This is my PhD on a single Old Norse saga called Hrómundar Saga Greipsonar. Then I will move to two ways of approaching this material from perspective of network analysis. First, I will talk about the saga in a network, so on the ways of understanding the saga's position in the macroorganism of Old Norse Icelandic literature. Next, I will focus on the network of the saga, so on the transmission history of this text in extant manuscripts and the scribal networks that produced these manuscripts. Both parts relied on digital methods of approaching manuscript transmitted texts, but in both cases, the importance of traditional hermeneutic approach is emphasized. The first case study uses network analysis to understand the context in which the saga appears, and the second one builds on the results of new thematic analysis to understand the life of my text, meaning its transmission history throughout centuries. In the first part, I will present some background information. In this presentation, we are going to travel through the realm of Old Norse Icelandic literature. As many of you know, from the 13th century onwards, Icelanders composed long prose narratives called sagas. The subject matter of these sagas can concern rulers of Scandinavia or early Icelanders or legendary Scandinavian heroes, and we call this text either King Sagas, Sagas of Icelanders, or Legendary Sagas. Due to the peculiar situation in Iceland, the popular literature of Iceland was copied by hand well until the 19th century, and Icelanders continued to compose texts in the traditional saga style, or at least inspired by that style, well into the same century. Therefore, the corpus of Icelandic manuscripts and texts includes hundreds of texts and thousands of manuscripts produced between 13th and 19th century. Hrómundar Saga Greipsonar is an Icelandic saga which traditionally is classified as a legendary saga. Legendary sagas are stories which deal with the legendary past of Scandinavia before the settlement of Iceland in the 9th century. The most famous representatives of this genre are probably Völsunga Saga, Ragnar Saga Lodbrokar, or Hrolf Saga Kraka. And if we compare Hrómundar Saga Greipsonar with other legendary sagas, especially focusing on the post-medieval ones, we can easily observe that this saga has received a remarkable amount of scholarly attention. And in my view, there are two reasons for this situation. The first one is that the protagonist of the saga, Hrómundur Grípsson, is mentioned in the Book of Settlements of Iceland, Landnámabók. There, Hromundur is presented as a great-grandfather of the first settlers, Ingólfur and Leifur, who arrived to Iceland in the second half of the 9th century. Another reason for the scholarly interest in Hromundur saga and its unique position in the history of Icelandic literature is the fact that Hromundur saga may be considered one of the earliest legendary sagas. It is mentioned in the famous description of the wedding feast in Reykjaholar from 1119, which is described in Þorgils Saga of Hafliða, a part of Sturlunga compilation. From this passage, we learn that at the wedding feast there was a story recited by Hrólfur, and this story featured some of the main characters and events that are also described in Hromundur Saga Greipsonar, as we know it today. The medieval version of the saga has not survived, and the saga as we know it today is a 17th century adaptation. The only extant medieval manifestation of the story of Hromundur is a metric form of rímur, called Griplur or Hromundarrímur Gripsonar. Various interpretations of the relationships between the saga and the rímur have been presented in the literature, but the consensus appears to be that the 17th century saga is based on the medieval rímur, and it is a fairly reliable prosification of the rímur. The rímur, in turn, are based on the lost saga, perhaps the same saga that was recited at the wedding feast in 1119, but which has received a number of amplifications from other sources. This 17th century saga is included in all collections of legendary sagas that have been printed since the 18th century. The first edition was Björners Nordiska Kampadater from 1737, where the Old Norse texts were published together with Latin and Swedish translations. Because of this late origin of the saga, it does not necessarily fit well with the other texts included in the corpus of legendary sagas, as most of them are dated to the 14th and 15th centuries. This makes Hromundur saga an interesting case study for investigations of the text genre affiliations. One might want to ask in which context this saga appears in extant manuscripts. Does it appear frequently in manuscripts with the older legendary sagas, or with the younger, rímur-based narratives? Can we see any patterns in the modes of saga's transmission which influence the co-occurrences with other texts? To answer these questions, I want to move to a discussion of the saga's position in the network of Old Icelandic literature. This work relies on the network analysis of Old Norse literature that I've prepared together with Taryn Wills and Tim Robotham. You can check their academia profiles while you listen to me. We used computer-assisted analysis to macro-analyze the manuscript context of Old Norse literature, and we presented our project in Göteborg in Sweden at the second DH Nordic conference in 2017. You can access our abstract through the link given on this slide. In this project, we tried to answer the question whether modern scholarly genre classifications of Icelandic literary corpus are reflected in manuscript transmission of these texts. The main reason behind our research was a disagreement between scholars regarding the traditional genre classifications. Some leading scholars in the field of Old Norse studies have been pointing at the manuscript context as a key for understanding the genre classification, but even though they all referred to manuscripts themselves, they arrived to contradicting conclusions regarding the genre boundaries. In our view, the limitation of the previous scholarship lies in the number of manuscripts a human being can manually examine and analyze. Therefore, instead of looking at a single manuscript, we have decided to collect and compile all the digital data currently available for Icelandic manuscripts. The main idea was to visualize the relationships between texts this manuscript preserves in a form of a network. We compiled our data from 4 main sources, 2 XML-based catalogs and 2 databases which covered basically Icelandic manuscripts in 23 repositories in Europe and North America. After some necessary cleaning of the data, we ended up with a dataset comprising of 674 unique titles or texts preserved in 1,330 manuscripts with almost 130,000 connections. We imported our data into Gephi in order to obtain a visualization of the relationships between the texts in the extant manuscripts. So on this slide you see our network that we presented in Göteborg in 2017. It is visualized with Force Atlas 2, and here texts are nodes and edges are the manuscripts that preserve these texts. The nodes are colored according to the traditional genre classifications, so yellow and orange for romances, pink and red for legendary sagas, green for Icelandic family sagas, and blue for king's sagas. And as you can see, the nodes in the same color tend to appear relatively close to each other. So we have this very tight cluster of Eddic poetry and this kind of big spread of saga literature, where the biggest cloud represents Icelandic family sagas, while legendary sagas are sort of stretched between romances, king sagas, and Icelandic family sagas. A way of evaluating the accuracy of the results we achieved was to check which are the strongest connections in the network and how they relate to our knowledge regarding the potential relationships between these texts. Here I will present 2 of the cases which we also presented in Göteborg. They all happen to be within the legendary sagas genre, and they are all well-known examples of strongly related texts due to their genealogical aspect. The first case is the case of Ketil Saga Heinz, Grimms Saga Loðingina, and Örvarod's Saga, which are all connected by the genealogy of the main characters. The next example is the relationship between Völsunga Saga and Ragnar's Saga Lodbrokar, where Ragnar's Saga is a sequel of sorts to Völsunga Saga. Since our network correctly visualized the relationships between texts which are known to be closely related due to their contents, I decided to use the network as an exploratory tool to understand my saga's position in the history of Old Norse Icelandic literature. As I said before, Hrómundar Saga belongs to the corpus of legendary sagas, but the text, as it is known today, is a post-medieval adaptation dated to the 17th century, and because of this, it might not fit well with the other older legendary sagas. So, does Hrómundar Saga appear frequently with the older legendary sagas, or with the younger, rímur-based narratives? Where is it in this absolutely illegible network of Old Norse texts we've prepared? Well, it is here, exactly in the middle, placed comfortably among other legendary sagas. Now, if we clean up our data a little bit, we can see that among the closest neighbors of Hrómundar Saga, there is a text which traditionally is not classified as a real legendary saga. It is Bragðaólfis Saga, which is a post-medieval legendary rímur-based saga. It has never been considered a member of legendary sagas, even though its subject matter fulfills the requirement for a legendary saga. This is interesting, as we would like to know the reasons for the co-occurrence of these 2 texts together in the manuscripts. Did scribes and commissioners at different points of time independently decided to put these two texts together, or are there some other factors that influence their transmission? To answer this research question, we need to turn to additional methods of interpreting the saga's history. And in my case, it's the new thematic approach which I find particularly useful. There is no space here to introduce computer-assisted thematics in detail, but I would like to bring to your attention some important publications in English where you can find further information. The earliest article I found that mentioned the similarities between thematology or thematics and cladistics appeared in 1977 when Norman Platning and Don Cameron pointed out that the cladistic method used in biology is applicable in all studies of historical interrelationships which are based on ancestor-descendant sequence. This idea has been extensively explored, for example, by various Dutch scholars such as Ben Salemans and Margot von Mulken. They applied cladistic method in what they called cladistic textual criticism. In Old Norse studies, we have to mention work by Peter Robinson and Robert O'Hara, and by Alaric Hall and Caitlin Parsons. What new thematics allows us to do is to generate unrooted trees of relationships between various witnesses of the same text. The unrooted trees can serve as a point of departure for further philological investigation. On this slide, you can see one of the unrooted stemmas of Hromundar Saga that I've generated during my PhD. You can see that there are at least 2 or 3 clear groupings of witnesses. On this slide, I marked with red triangles all the manuscripts which preserve Hromundar Saga together with Bragdaulfis Saga. As you can see, this co-occurrence appears in the majority of the manuscripts in the left-hand side of this slide, so in the manuscripts which I classified later as a text group B. Now, if we focus on these manuscripts in particular, some interesting patterns can be observed. First of all, let's look at the center of this unrooted stemma. We have here 2 manuscripts, which I call P67 and A601. One is today in Reykjavik, the other one is in Stockholm. So what these 2 manuscripts have in common, besides that they preserve both Hromundar Saga and Bragdaulfis Saga? Well, they are both written by the same scribe, a certain Jon Eggertsson, who was living at the end of the 17th century. While there is no earlier manuscript of Hromundar Saga known to us, we know that in 1683 Jon brought to Sweden a manuscript which preserved Hromundar Rimur, together with Bragdaulfis Rimur. So the medieval poems on which our post-medieval sagas are based on. Then, around the same time, in the late 80s of the 17th century, Jon wrote A601 and P67, both preserving the prose versions of the sagas. In the previous scholarship, it has been suggested that Jon Eggertsson was an author of the post-medieval Hromundar Saga, and it seems quite possible to me that he converted both Hromundar Rimur and Bragdaulfis Rimur into prose, using the Rimur manuscript that he brought in 1683 as an exemplar. Now, if we move further to the left of our unrooted tree, I want to focus on 3 manuscripts which also preserve these 2 texts, but which were written by different scribes in different regions of Iceland and in different periods. It is British Library manuscript 4859 from 1695, L633 from 1721, now in Reykjavik, and A395 from around 1764, also in Reykjavik. So let's see what they have in common. Well, the ownership history of some of them can be traced for a few generations. On this slide, you can see a map of northwest of Iceland. In the upper left corner, the blue point, is the location where the commissioner of B4859 was living. After his death in 1702, his manuscripts were most likely inherited by his daughter, and B4859 had to be one of them, as it appears on the list of books owned by her husband. Magnus's daughter was living in Vididalstunga, and while B4859 was most likely in Vididalstunga, in Þingeyrar, which is around 25 kilometers north from Vididalstunga, Lauritz Gottrup commissioned the writing of L633. We don't know the whereabouts of L633 after Gottrup's death in 1721, but around 1750 it was owned by Kaur Olafsson from Munaðarnes. So finally, in 1760s, A395 is written on Akrar, around 50 kilometers west from Munaðarnes. Given this geographic proximity of an assumed exemplars and their copies, it seems possible to me that in these manuscripts, the texts of Hromundar Saga and Bragdaolvis Saga were copied one after another from one manuscript to another. While we don't know whether the texts of Bragdaolvis Saga in these three manuscripts follow the pattern of Hromundar Saga, as no complete study of this saga yet exists, we know that the other saga, which appears in these manuscripts, behaves in the same way. The study of the transmission history of Mirman's Saga by Desmond Slay has demonstrated that Mirman's Saga's texts in these three manuscripts can be organized in an ancestor-descendant order which looks exactly like the one of Hromundar Saga. So it would be interesting to know whether the other texts preserved in these manuscripts are also closely related. There are at least two other sagas in addition to Bragdaolvis Saga, which I would expect to follow the same pattern. It's Hervarar Saga of Heidreks and Kirjalax Saga. In my presentation today, I focused on two ways of looking at text transmission, and I demonstrated how these approaches can facilitate our research. On one hand, I presented the position of my saga in the network of Old Norse Icelandic literature. It confirmed the traditional genre affiliation of the saga, but it also revealed the text which most frequently appears together with my saga in the manuscripts. On the other hand, I turned to the computer-assisted methods of textual criticism to understand the text transmission from one manuscript to another. Neither approach alone is sufficient to understand the transmission history of the texts we are working with, and even together they still require further interpretation. I hope that I successfully demonstrated that the interpretation of the data still relies on the traditional philological work, including, for instance, scribe attribution and ownership history. The mere fact that Hromundar Saga appears together with Bragdaolvis Saga is perhaps interesting, but not really meaningful or significant to me without an in-depth analysis of the underlying data. At the same time, I believe that this twofold approach applied in my presentation today allowed me to present you a more nuanced view of my saga's history. Therefore, I hope that in the future more Old Norse studies will look at the transmission history of sagas as a system or as a network of relationships, rather than as a linear process of corruption of isolated texts from one manuscript to another. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you cannot join us for the live session next week, feel free to tweet your questions at Katarzyna Ann. Thank you. Take care.